Hello, my name is Robert Thiemann. I'm the founder of Frame. Welcome to Frame Live. Today we will be talking about classrooms, about education and the role that spatial design can play in education. If you have children, if you're watching and you have children, you know what schools and not going to school means for you and for your children. I have a kid 5 years old and she hasn't seen much of the inside of her school for many, many months over the last year. And by the looks of it, that won't happen within the next months either. So what has this enforced period of separation from school classes taught us about the role of spatial design in education? How can we apply those learnings to make sure that the future of schools is more resilient, more inspiring, and more inclusive? That's what we will discuss in 45 minutes to 1 hour today with a panel consisting of two experts in the field. I'd like to welcome Pallavi Dean from Dubai, United Arab Emirates. She's the founder and creative director of a boutique agency called Aurora in Dubai, where she leads a team of 15 people, and believe it or not, 14 of them are female. And the most notable educational projects designed by Aurora include the Nursery of the Future in Dubai. That's a learning project that reimagined the concept of an early years learning space, and the Sharjah Research, Technology and Innovation Park, and the headquarters for the Early Childhood Authority in Abu Dhabi. Welcome, Pallavi. Then my second panel member is John Cicconi. He's the Global K-12 Education Practice Leader and Associate Director at Skidmore, Owings Merrill, SOM in New York. Welcome, John. John has helped shape some of SOM's most dynamic and influential work, including the Moynihan Train Hall and Denver Union Station, and educational projects such as the University Center at the New School and PS62. That's New York's first net zero energy school. So that was me introducing you in a very brief manner. Now, Pallavi, you have two kids.
That's right, an 8-year-old and a 10-year-old.
And what have they seen from their school in the last year?
Actually, they went back to school in September. So in fall, the school was back to normal. But, every time there was a positive COVID case or a teacher contracted it, the school went down into panic mode and locked down for a couple of weeks before they restarted. But to be honest, just from a parenting point of view, it's been a relief seeing the back of them and seeing them go back to school.
And what about you, John? You have children too. You live in New York. Totally different situation.
Different situation. Yes, I'm a father. My oldest is in first grade. My youngest is 2 years old. And her school went fully remote towards the end of her kindergarten year. And so we were, fully enmeshed in homeschooling. She's back now about half-time in a blended learning situation. So about half of the days of the week, I can actually get work done. The other half, I'm fully in teacher mode.
So, Pallavi, you approached Frame some months ago with a report, a paper based on research that you had undertaken with your company. What brought you to that endeavor?
Yeah, that's a good question, Robert. So we put out this white paper on what is the future school? What does a post-pandemic school look like? Why did I do it? So we just finished the Nursery of the Future. We finished Sharjah Research and Technology Park. And, it was so digital based. It was all about robotics. It was all about coding. And the minute we went into lockdown, I started questioning that paradigm, right? Because what I was craving was biophilic spaces. I was craving these outdoor spaces. And I also wanted to answer some broader questions. In the UAE, we have a lot of premium schools, so franchise models, the elite schools from the UK and the US, they're here in the UAE. But there's the whole affordable sector, or the lower tier sector of schooling that was ignored. So when you look at concepts like de-densification, you can do that easily in a premium school, but you can't really do it when you don't have the space to do it. So I just wanted to answer those big questions.
What's your most remarkable takeaway from that piece of research?
I think the one thing that kind of stood out to me is that, look, the magic really happens in the science labs, the maker spaces, the drama theater spaces, or the playground, right? That's the socialization, the connectivity. And we can do a lot of the blended learning or that Khan Academy style model, where it's learning on demand. So you click and you get a lesson on demand. But the real magic really happens in those spaces. So for me, the big takeaway is that bricks and mortar is here to stay, and no amount of digitization or blended learning is ever going to, move us away from that.
Yeah, they call the classroom the third educator. John, being an architect, a designer yourself, and having worked on many educational projects, what learning did you take away from doing all those projects, designing all those classrooms? What's the basis of a good classroom?
I would say a good classroom is something that reinforces the pedagogy of its school, and so that becomes the sort of instrument of teaching. Schools are very intensely program-driven projects or buildings, and that I think a great school sort of seamlessly gets you from the mission of the school to being able to sort of seamlessly implement that in the students. So, great natural daylighting that improves student focus, or proper air changes in the mechanical systems so that kids are alert and able to focus. Surfaces that are durable and easy to clean, but also trying to take all that and create something beautiful that makes people happy about going to work every day, teachers, administrators. So I hope that in the future, as this typology adapts, we don't sort of overcorrect for pandemic-proof design, and we're able to keep that that sense of being able to seamlessly connect the school's mission to the students in a very physical way.
So speaking about the future, this is exactly what we're going to do in the next 45 minutes, trying to navigate the future of the classroom, so to say. And those of you in the audience who are familiar with the format of Frame Live, you know what I'm going to say now. For those who are tuning in for the first time now, we have a specific format for Frame Live, which revolves around images. So you won't be only looking at our talking heads, you will be also looking at images of classrooms and buildings. And we have asked John and Pallavi to send their images reflecting their ideas about the pre-pandemic situation of education, the current situation, so let's say the situation in lockdown or the pandemic situation, and we have asked them to submit an image that reflects the standpoint when it comes to the future. So the post-pandemic situation of education. So this is the starting point of our discussion between the three of us. And I would like to kick off with Pallavi, with your ideas around the pre-pandemic state of affairs when it comes to education. And you submitted the next image. Indeed, it is a very old-fashioned looking classroom.
So it's my classroom. I went to an Indian curriculum school in the UAE, and back in the 80s, that's what it was. So, I think the teachers were almost encouraging us to cheat, because I could just literally look over my shoulder and copy the spellings of, my neighbor there. But you look at the density of the classroom, you look at the hard materials that were used. There's not a single soft surface in there. So you can imagine the acoustics wasn't great. And, we talk about these spaces that are inspiring and that are a silent educator. Acoustics is such an important part of that equation, right? So the density was a big issue when I was growing up. Access to natural daylight, John touched upon that. We had little windows. It was almost like we were in a jail prison cell, as institutional as it could get, and very much a sermon style lecture format, right? So the teachers at the head of the table giving the sermon, and we're just in rows of desks. And for me, kind of, this is the epitome, or this is what symbolizes what education was for me growing up.
So education for you was doing with little daylight, hard materials, bad acoustics, one teacher in front of everybody, and sitting really, really on the lap of your neighbor.
And you know what, Robert, this is why I have this aversion to any kind of hard seats. Because can you imagine sitting on that chair for 8 to 10 hours a day? And, literally for me, it's just like being in a jail cell. So now when I look at my kids' IB curriculum school and this amazing collaborative spaces they have, I'm like, wow, I was really shortchanged,
Is there anything from that setup, from that era, that you nevertheless want to keep, that you want to give to your children?
The one thing, and I think, schooling hasn't really changed that much in the last 150 years. There's been a little evolution in the last 3 years, but not massively. So the one thing that I really enjoyed was we had a science lab, where we did like little experiments and stuff. But I think I would like to keep that, but it's already there in schools today. Everyone has, a high-tech science lab. So that's the one thing I would keep.
That's not a lot. Nevertheless, you made it. You're now here. What did you train for in the end? As an architect or a designer, or what's your?
As an architect. That's right.
Okay. And your university classroom looked the same, or was already an improvement?
It was already an improvement because there was a lot more collaboration. So it was almost like a flipped classroom. So there was that group learning, but then there were also these individual spaces that we could break out into. So university was a big kind of step up.
So you can already see in this image what doesn't work if a pandemic hits. And that is people sitting almost on each other's lap. It doesn't really work. You need to keep your distance. Is there anything else that makes this kind of setup, so the old-fashioned setup that you experienced firsthand, not future-proof?
Yeah, I think the density is the big kind of takeaway, but also we are different types of learners. There's 4 different types of learners, right? Not everybody can sit in one place and just take in this sermon style education. So I think the school spaces have to be catered and developed or in direct response to the type of learning abilities one has. If you're a kinetic learner, you need to get out there. You need to be, in physical contact with the space. And I think, yeah, that's why that school setting really failed, because it didn't address that question of pedagogy or that question of curriculum.
Cool, very clear. And for you, a good source of inspiration, how not to approach educational spaces, I guess.
Absolutely. You learn from experience, right? We are all a sum of our experiences. And for me, I have such an aversion to that setting that I would never, ever duplicate it.
Thanks, Pallavi. What about you, John? What does pre-pandemic education stand for from your point of view?
Well, I think, I mentioned before that I think, classrooms and educational buildings should be sort of conduits for the school's mission to the students. And I think one thing, especially for younger children who are in school, or for those just entering college, for students in a very transitional moment in their life, schools played tremendous roles in social emotional development, and it's especially an issue for early childhood, and that is suffering greatly with children not being in school, not being able to interact. So this is a project that we designed. This is the PS62 Net Zero Energy School in New York. And it's designed to encourage interaction between students, face-to-face interaction between students, but also interaction between students and teachers, direct sight lines, and, designed to be sort of open. We talked about natural daylight. All of the classrooms here receive, 90% of the time, you don't even need to turn the lights on because of the amount of natural daylight that you're able to harvest through sloping ceilings and skylights and things like that. White surfaces also bounce the light around. And it's this sort of open, airy sense where you can see where you're going, see other people in the space. So that's something that I would hope that we don't overcorrect to make pandemic proof and lose the ability to do that. I think another really important issue of what schools functioned before pandemics, and this is something that's sort of tearing, I can feel it tearing at the social fabric of New York, and I'm sure it's the case elsewhere too, but the notion of the equity of home learning, especially for parents with young children, because not everybody is able to do their jobs remotely and juggle children being at home. And schools, public schools especially, and especially the New York City school system where my kids go to school, it's it's an issue of equity, and I'm not even sure. Like we are all privileged to be able to have jobs where we can work from home and juggle the childcare demands, as difficult as they may be. Not everybody's in that situation. And in fact, when New York City went remote, the absentee rates spiked by as much as 10 to 20%. And what that says to me is that there are massive amounts of children there that the school system lost track of towards the end of last year. And now with at least every school in New York being blended learning, I'm hoping that that's gotten better, and that these children haven't fallen off the grid, completely. But I think that speaks to the need of kids to be able to be in school and parents to be able to depend on schools as a place where they can safely have their kids, if they do need to work.
Well, the image that you showed, the project that you realized, is already a major step forward when compared to Pallavi's school. In which respect is this project not pandemic proof?
I hope that it is. Maybe we, in retrospect, we could have widened the corridors if we knew there would be a pandemic, so that two groups of students could pass, and perhaps the other half of that corridor could have been for casual seating or things like that. I think that's a direction that education was trending anyway, towards being able to have like wider corridors, use that for casual interaction space. And so these are the kinds of measures that I think schools design should embrace in the future. Architects are masters at taking constraints like designing for pandemic and making them invisible. And so, I would hope that we would all be able to figure out how to take these new constraints and turn them into a positive, and not something that inhibits us from making great buildings.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's have a look at the next series of images, which is all related to the pandemic. So the current situation that education is in. Probably most of the countries are in lockdown. Children are not visiting school, except for Dubai, where the situation seems to be back to normal. We can only dream of that. It's been a long time since we've had that. We're craving for it. So Pallavi, nevertheless, what does this image represent for you?
I'm going to talk about this image, but I just want to touch upon something that John said. He talked about kind of circulation spaces and the corridor spaces. Look, I feel, and I very much agree with John, COVID is accelerating trends that were already there. We shouldn't waste a crisis. That's what a good crisis does. Like it shakes up norms, it breaks down barriers. So, if we were like kind of 20%, oh yes, let's have more corridor spaces. Now everyone's like, yes, please, can we do that? The operators, the school owners, is like, there is no argument there about it, right? And we also have to think about how we reduce those ratios. So if we, typically 20 to 25% of the space is given to corridors, we can reduce that to 5%, which is pure circulation, but then they become those spaces for casual interactions. They become those spaces for that diffused learning, where a fifth grader is learning something from a second grader, right? So I love that John brought that up. I'm sorry to interrupt the flow here, but we can go to that image that you just shared.
Not at all. Thank you for bringing that up, Pallavi.
So this is an image of my two little boys, right? So when we were in lockdown and they were home learning for about 4 months when the pandemic hit. And, when it all started, it was nerve-wracking for us as a family unit. I'd never done this digital learning, and they, at the time it was 7 and 9, and they were trying to get their head around how the tech works, just a simple, I was like, just type it. And they're like, well, what? Like type in the chat? So explaining the basics of them. But at one point, I think there was a day that we all gave up on learning. And I said, you know what? Forget all this. Here's a couple of pens. Here's a paper. Here's a scale ruler. just let that creativity that you have inside you, or that learning that you have inside you, let it just out on this piece of paper. So I think it also brought a lot of things in perspective for me, right? Because they're in an IB school. It was the first time I've ever seen the education that they receive. Again, in the 80s, I went to the Indian curriculum school. It was very different. All of their learning was so project based, which just opened my eyes up. I was like, wow, they're actually going to a really good school. And it was more kind of vocational or project based rather than kind of do your spellings or do your math equations. So I love this picture because it captures for me what that period was, what that lockdown situation was. And there were days when we just backed off and I said, you know what, if you miss 5 classes, you're not going to be any less smarter. Let's just have fun. Let's just play and let's just be creative at home.
Are there any learnings for you in this picture?
Yeah, for me, the big learning was I'm really blown away by how teachers do what they do, because the quality of education my children are receiving is phenomenal and I could never do it. The second thing is, I think I underestimated the psychological impact of not seeing other children, because we were in a very severe lockdown, right? So my children had not seen any other children for, 4 months, really. So I really understood the importance of the social interaction and how the learning really does come from there. So, when you're in a classroom, yes, the teacher is giving you the information, but it's the discussion or a little comment that your colleague or your classmate makes that adds to the learning. And also kind of watching that on Zoom or on Teams or whatever really solidified that concept for me.
So does it make you a slightly different designer of educational projects, this insight?
Yes, I think absolutely. I would say, the future for me, whenever I do my next education space, is I'm going to reduce the number of classrooms, but kind of really give that real estate to those magic spaces, the collaboration hubs. I want WeWork style spaces in my new schools. I want a focus on the outdoor play areas, that seamless connection between indoor, outdoor, and all the good stuff that, John was showing in his slide, just those sight lines, which are great for connection, but they also help something else, like they stop bullying, they stop vandalism. So good design can really be an advocate for those kind of things as well.
Thanks, Pallavi. Then your image, John.
Right. So I had a slightly different take on the current situation. So this is from the Spanish flu pandemic of 1915. This was taken in New York City, and this is a classroom on a ferry in the East River in the middle of the winter. And I show this to say that this to me is an example of the type of ingenuity that we haven't really seen. I think schools globally have really pushed the burden of ingenuity onto parents. And I think that, in the next pandemic, I think a goal should really be to keep all the children in school and to not sort of have, society for parents kind of grind to a halt in the same way. You look at the healthcare industry. When the pandemic started, they didn't go half capacity, right? They figured out lots of ways to boost capacity. They had temporary buildings all over the place. They, increased the capacity of their mechanical systems. They took all types of safety measures, and they did it very quickly. And I think, as a society, we need to treat the social emotional health and development of our children with the same urgency that was given towards, other aspects of healthcare. And I think schools are a big part of that. And, it says a lot that our society has sort of not been this creative in solving our current crisis at the moment.
Why do you think is that?
I wish I knew. I mean, I know when lockdown started, this is the first thing that I started thinking about. And I was obsessed with trying to figure out how schools were going to open in September. When everybody started, in New York, everybody across the city started working from home mid-March, essentially. I don't know how that timing played with other countries. And I was completely obsessed with that. I know a lot of people in the education and design world were completely obsessed with how do we take these existing schools and have them function so that society can people who depend on them can depend on them, can continue to depend on them. And there's lots of great ideas that would allow that to happen. I just think that, you know, blended learning and is something that schools were doing beforehand, and it's become a part of pedagogy in a lot of instances. Like the Dalton School in New York City is a great institution. They're extremely forward thinking, and blended learning was already a part of their curriculum, where children would sort of watch a lecture at home. This is for older kids. Watch a lecture at home, and then the class time is dedicated to discussing it, you know, and that kind of thing. So it's like you're maximizing your time in the classroom and face-to-face interactions, and then the strictly lecture part, like everything that was in the sort of first image of the dense classroom, that's a classroom where you're being talked to. And, you know, to me, that's something that can occur digitally, and really the sort of face-to-face interaction, the discussion type thing, like those things are much better served in person. You know, spontaneous discussions about things that you've learned, you know, all those things are being missed at the moment.
Sorry, Robert, I just wanted to jump in on something that John touched on, right? This ingenuity of how to get back to school. So when we had to get back to school, you look at the basic space, like a dining hall, it's used 20% of time of the school day. They were repurposed into classrooms when our children went back. And I thought that was great. You know, okay, we couldn't build modular classrooms really quickly, you know, and it was really hot in September, like it's 40 degrees in the UAE. So that wasn't an option. But then the sports hall and the dining room, those spaces that were used for a short amount of time in a school, they were repurposed. And I thought, okay, how else can we push this?
I'm not knocking all schools. I'm saying, and there was definitely a lot of ingenuity and a lot of people that have worked really hard. It hasn't had the same, you know, impact as in other fields where I think it was prioritized to have these things function. Like healthcare was treated as a must-have in a way that schools weren't, I would say.
So 100 years ago, well, more than 100 years ago, when this what kind of epidemic?
It was called the Spanish flu. I'm not exactly sure what it was, right?
When the Spanish flu was all over the world, then they took children outside to continue learning. Why didn't it happen this year, do you think? I can't answer that question. I think that, you know, if you look at that generation, at least in America, that was quite a hardy generation. The people that were in school at that time and then went through 2 world wars, and then, you know, they call them the greatest generation. So maybe that was part of stealing them. But yeah, I can't answer that question. You know, I think it's probably a little bit dangerous to have children outdoors in that temperature, and we know that now, you know, for prolonged periods of time. And so, you know, certainly, you know, schools are doing what they can with what they have at the moment. Okay, let's leave it at that. So let's continue to the future, to have a look at the future. And audience, if you have a question for our panelists, please ask that question using the Q&A button at the bottom menu of Zoom. So the future, post-pandemic, Pallavi, what will we have learned, or what should we have learned to make future education more inspiring, more resilient, and more inclusive?
Yeah, look, Robert, you live in Amsterdam. John lives in New York. You guys have access to some amazing green spaces, right? I live in a desert. That's where my children are growing up. And we have the beautiful kind of, you know, these barren vistas, which are very inspiring. But I think what we really crave, and that, you know, that's what the pandemic has really brought to life for me, is this connection to nature. You know, yes, the desert is one form of it, but I really do genuinely believe that the future classroom has to be this kind of nature-based space. But also, I think, you know, you asked John the question, why aren't we doing it? You know, why aren't we on the ferry? And John's absolutely right. That was a hardcore generation. And, you know, they were just like, we got this, and the kids can be out in -10, it's fine. But I also think we've started cocooning our children. There's a very high level of fear factor. Putting them out in the nature is also helping with their analog skills. Now, again, with, you know, their gross motor skills. With early learning education, they can't just be cooped up in a little, you know, man-made space. They need to go out there and develop their fine motor skills, the gross motor skills. And also we need to encourage them to take risks, because that's how children learn, right? That's a big part of education. And another thing, kind of, it's related to kind of pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, whatever else. We have to stop creating like this disaster movie scene, because everywhere we go out now, you have the yellow and black tape and keep these distances. You have to think about how that's going to affect a 5-year-old child, a 3-year-old child, an 18-year-old child. Graphics, space planning does impact the psychology. And I think instead what we should look at doing is within classrooms, we need to create defensible spaces. So cocooned environments. So you're still part of the broader classroom, but you have your own zone. But also think about, it's not just about the students, it's about the educators. We need to have sanctuaries for them to kind of go away to, right? Because because we're doing blended learning, they're not only delivering a physical lecture, they're doing extra classes to do it online, right? So I think they need counseling spaces and sanctuary spaces to take a break. I think all of that is really important.
There's somebody in the audience addressing the fact that in some places private schools are already what does she say? Open schools exist in Italy, and they have been pointed out as sustainable examples to continue schooling. That's what Giulia Maria Moshin says. But these are private schools. And she thinks there's a big difference in approach between private schools and public schools. So are we going to go in that direction, discussing the differences between private and public schooling?
Yeah, I mean,
John,
I've
do you want
worked
to step in?
yeah, sure. I've worked on a lot of private schools and I've worked on a lot of public schools, and the differences are stark, just between the resources and the focus on the children, versus not having the resources and having to provide for very large number of children in the case of the New York City school district. So it's and right now. Yeah, I would hope that public schools continue to exist and be well funded and be a continued source of education for the people who need it, because in America, private schools are quite expensive. I don't know exactly worldwide, but.
So coming back to the inclusion of nature or the access to nature, Pallavi. You say we in Amsterdam and we in New York, we have that possibility. You don't have that in the UAE. What can you do about it? You do have nature. I mean, your nature is simply different. But what can you do about it as an architect living in Dubai?
I think that's a great question, because Dubai, look, I'm not talking about artificial nature, right? Dubai has tons of golf courses, which are, artificially irrigated. That's not a sustainable way to look at agriculture or bringing nature within the space. But I think there's a lot of biophilic elements that you can incorporate within a space that are also safe, right? You can use petrified wood, you can use natural materials within your interior palettes. Nature does not necessarily mean just having a tree within a space. So I think there are other ways as an architect, as a designer, that we can bring nature within a space just through materiality. Or, my son went to a nursery school which had a little, they had rabbits running around the fields, which is totally safe, sustainable. Nature is also that connection to animals. So I think there are many things you can do. It's not just about having trees. I'm just saying on a personal level, I've really missed having, or being in a forest environment or that greenery, because all I see is hardscape and desert. And as hauntingly beautiful as that is, I think as a human, we grew up, genetically, we grew up in a savanna setting. So you need that canopy of the tree and the desert in the backdrop. You need both, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything else that will make the classroom more future-proof, except from this access or proximity to nature?
Yeah, I think we have to look at things like, a combination of analog and digital learning, right? We talk about asynchronous learning and synchronous learning. So John touched upon this as well. I need to have on-demand learning when I want it and access it. One of my kind of pet hates about the education system, which it has not evolved in the last 100, 150 years, is the fact that children wake up at 7 a.m. to go to school. You try waking up a 13-year-old or 14-year-old at that time, their brain's not functioning. They're actually more productive in the afternoon hours or the evening hours. They should have access to asynchronous learning where they can get that on demand, and then they can have their discussions or whatever in a time that suits them. So for me, this is the one thing that I hope we can take away from the pandemic, that you can have asynchronous learning and synchronous learning when you choose to.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, Pallavi. What about you, John? What's your future vision of schooling?
I think I would hope that it doesn't look that different from learning before the pandemic, and that I wouldn't want to preclude anything that schools wanted to do from happening. Like, I think design should still be a conduit between the pedagogy of what schools want to teach and the end result of a classroom where children learn well. But in order to do that, I think schools need to have a plan, and school buildings need to be more resilient to be able to accommodate pandemics and to stay functioning in a pandemic. And this was a sketch that we did that very quickly has turned into a reality. And this is an idea for a temporary classroom that can either be temporary or permanent. But the notion is that it's made up of modular components. It's rapidly deployable, and it's able to be put up and set up very, very quickly. We have investors for this. We are meeting with fabricators to define the proof of concept, but the notion is that this is something that could be quickly deployed, and quickly taken down, or maybe it's something that looks okay if it had to stay there for a while. If you go back to the previous slide, just want to speak to some of the things about it. It's sort of a larger footprint to allow spacing. It has high ceilings, which you're not able to achieve in the current modular technology because of constraints of a modular and how it arrives to the site, being able to fit under bridges on the bed of a flatbed truck. So these are components that are put together rapidly in the course of maybe a day. Hopefully, that's something that we're currently in the process of proving out. But also because it's assembled, maybe a few of these could go in a gym, or maybe a few of these could go on the roof of an urban school. It's something that is not constrained to only, taking up school parking lots and those kind of things. In terms of, so it has a few pandemic ideas built into it. Like, one is the airflow, that, you'll see the wooden piece in the background. Air would come in high, and then there's a sort of raised floor below the students and registers at each child, so that everybody sort of has their own fresh air, right, that comes from high and then is exhausted down low. And that's a way to further sort of prevent spread between students. All the surfaces are able to be wiped down every day. The desks are movable. That's actually a desk and chair product that already exists. So it could be something like this, or it could be small groups, or it's something that I think teachers like that could serve a wide range of classroom configurations as either a small group, or you could arrange them to be discussion oriented as well. So this is the idea being that if you have to space kids out, so if the 24-person classroom became a 12-person classroom, then you're displacing roughly half the school, and then you could supplement that with temporary classrooms, whether it's like this or any way you want to do it. Just, I think we need to make it a priority to keep schools open next time.
So would you look at this as being a temporary solution, or at best a semi-permanent solution?
I think in America, the way that modular classroom industry is set up is that schools will often have a shortfall of academic space or an increase in students, and they need to get these temporary classrooms, and they're leased out to schools. And so that becomes part of their operating budget as opposed to their capital budget. And schools often have difficulty raising money to make large capital improvements. So they get stuck with these modulars that are not great learning environments. And so if that's going to happen, we wanted to make a better modular or a better, if you're going to be stuck with the space, like we would prefer that it be a space that makes learning a little bit more easy, that has good airflow, good natural daylight, and it is not sort of inhibiting teaching and learning.
So is there anything that you would take from this and incorporate in a permanent classroom?
That's a great question. I think durable materials, great natural daylight. And I think some of these, this is sort of an evolving field that I'm not an expert in, but we do have experts at SOM in this field, how to rethink air circulation in buildings. And this is, I do think there are going to be mechanical air circulation changes made to buildings post-pandemic. And I do think that will be a part of, the permanent infrastructure of buildings going forward. Yeah, this is an idea. I'm not quite sure this is the best idea, but the notion of a raised floor kind of allows you to reconfigure the returns, below the furniture level. Don't know if that makes sense for every school building, but it's something else that I think can be studied as we, as this moves forward.
Pallavi, is this close to your vision of creating WeWork-like education?
Not quite, but it is a great classroom concept. But my whole thinking is that we need to have fewer classrooms and more WeWork spaces within a school. So I think you need both. It's not mutually exclusive. But things that, John touched on, we need to think about antimicrobial surfaces. I mean, that should be a given. That's the first thing that is typically value engineered out of a school project, because the school operator or the school owner is always looking to maximize on how much they're spending. So I think that the surfaces, we really need to think about that. Again, for things like vandalism and for durability, right? That's important. HEPA filtration systems, they've been around forever. They're super expensive, so we don't get to use them in schools. If you look at the kind of filtration system that you use on an aircraft, it's very advanced. Why aren't we bringing some of that technology into architecture and building typology when it exists? Another key takeaway, actually I forgot about it, but in the pandemic, just because Robert shared this image, it came to mind, is contactless, right? How many doors are you opening to get into a toilet? How many flushes and how many faucets are you opening? That needs to go. Everything needs to be sensor operated in a school. The more contactless, the touch points that you have for the children, the better. So even, like my children have this access card to open different areas of the school. That should all be biometric now. And we need to start thinking like that. This technology exists. It's not rocket science. It's not 2030. It's 2021. We're just not applying it, predominantly because of the budget. So we need to think about the life cycle cost and the long-term benefits of investing in these technologies in schools today.
There are two interesting questions from the audience. First one is by Olivia Haley Schmidt, and that's for you, Pallavi. You mentioned needing to convince clients to use space in different ways. So how much forward momentum do you as an architect need to bring to a project versus how much the school wants to change their space type?
Look, I think in any project, be it a school or be it a hotel, our job, I always say this, I'm only 20% an architect and designer. I'm 80% a salesperson and an educator, because it's our job as designers to educate the client. But how do you educate them? You don't just tell them, this is a good design, here, sign here. No, this is a good design. This is a return on investment on your design. This is why I'm doing. So whenever you couple your design ideas with evidence-based design or with science, you and I can argue, Robert, I like yellow, I don't like yellow. That's subjective. You can't argue with hard facts, density, ratios, those kind of things. So when I went to the school and I said to them, listen, you're using the dining hall 20% of your school day. We need to repurpose the space. You're wasting 20 to 25% of your asset on circulation spaces. We need to rethink those areas. The minute you talk about sweating the asset or return on investment, I promise you, any school operator, any school owner will listen to you.
So you need to rationalize your design. You need to come up with evidence that your design works. You need to come with facts and figures and not trying to convince your clients because you try to impose your taste on them?
Or you want to be published in Frame. I see a lot of projects that are just beautiful, but they have to be functional. I just think that we have to stop this egocentric, design-driven attitude. It really irks me. You have to design things that are functional and that give people real return on investment and create experiences for the users.
And just to rephrase the word functional, that means human-centric, right? Or user-centric.
100%. 100%. It's
and not egocentric.
Yeah.
So the second question again is for you, Pallavi, and that's from Ayesha Kaisar. Is there any indigenous precedents or indigenous learning environment from the Gulf region we could look at that you know of? After all, holistic learning, especially as you describe it, must have taken place before we came so international style oriented.
Yes, so the UAE is very much influenced by the British curriculum and the British learning system. So when the UAE is a very young country, like super young, right? So I think the first schools, and I've seen images of these schools, right? They were very traditional classroom, probably fewer people, but it was a closed room, small windows, because again, vernacular architecture in the region had very small windows just to keep the heat out. Now we have these big glass buildings and we air condition them, which is not very sustainable. But those old vernacular type of architecture, it was very close, adobe walls, very thick, small windows, and a chalkboard. I mean, who even uses a chalkboard anymore? But I think there's not indigenous examples, Ayesha, but definitely it was influenced by the British curriculum system and is a very formal classroom setting.
Thank you. Then there's a question from Maurice Tobias. Let's address that to you, John. There have been examples of meditative practices for students in inner city schools, which have proven effective in reducing and stress and boosting productivity. Would this approach be beneficial for the stress induced by pandemic constraints?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an education, that sounds like a program question. It sounds good to me. I don't know. I think you'd have to ask an educator or somebody who's an expert in that. But certainly I think, yeah, the mental health of this current generation of children growing up with this pandemic is going to be an issue in years to come. And I think it's up to all of us to figure out what effects this is going to have on this generation that's going through it. I would love to answer the next question too. I had my eyes on that one.
So that is a question by Samira Hanif. With all the design and technology interventions now required, are poor public schools doomed? It's a very good
question. I believe the answer to that is no. I do think that there are a lot of common sense tweaks that you can make to schools without radically reinventing them to have them be resilient in the face of a future pandemic. And that's, with a lot of the current systems that are in school design manuals that, public school districts use to build new public schools. And I think a lot of that is things like making the corridors wider to promote, circulation in both directions, having sort of demountable partitions between two classrooms so that you can keep a large class size together and it can sort of grow into that space. Supplementing with, not everything has to be the schoolhouse. I know that lots of temporary hospitals were built with this event type structures that you can get very, very cheaply. They're sort of steel framed with vinyl outlines that can be used in emergency situations, and those are very, very inexpensive. I think those can be used to supplement school capacity to keep kids there. And so I think there are a lot of things that you can build into the current public school budgets and technology in small and subtle ways to future-proof schools from pandemics going forward. It doesn't all need to be the school of the future, that requires massive budgets. I think there are tweaks that we can make with existing technologies.
Can I jump in on the wellness question, if you don't mind? So I am an educator. I teach at a university, right? So I just, because John said an educator should answer this, so I'm just putting my hand up. I'm going to jump in on that one.
Yes,
But listen, wellness is such an important part, of design, right? I mean, now we have well certification, right? It's happening in office spaces. It should happen in education spaces as well. Having a space to kind of break away, whether it's hypnosis, whether it's meditation, whether it's prayer, I think those wellness rooms need to be built in. Don't forget that when people at universities, right, you could be a breastfeeding mother, right? You don't know what age group or what demographic you're catering to. So I think wellness is such an important focus, and that's a great question. I think that needs to be built in. And to just one quick point I want to add to Samira's question, when the lockdown hit, a lot of people had unstable internet connections. A lot of people didn't have devices. Like, we're all talking about that elite private school sector. The real problem is in that lower tier, in that affordable sector. And yeah, I agree with Samira. I just hope that, they're not doomed now if we go to this blended learning model. The government, or, I think the government needs to step in, or these private schools need to step in to kind of mitigate some of that and assist these other children as well.
Coming back to the wellness question, you speak about rooms for meditation and rooms for seclusion, so you can have a moment for yourself, do a prayer or whatsoever. Shouldn't every space, or almost every space, have an element that induces well-being? We speak about the use of material, certain shapes and forms that make you calmer. Isn't that something that you can build in as a designer, as an architect, into almost every space? Why should it be separated?
You are 100% right. The space itself should promote well-being. You look at the image that John shared. He was talking about daylighting. He was talking about clever use of color. That's all promoting well-being. But I do think that we need retreat spaces. So it's really good to, have an overall overarching well-being architecture, but you need retreat spaces. Prayer is a very private thing. Meditation is also a very private thing. I wouldn't feel comfortable meditating in a WeWork style space. So I'm promoting WeWork style spaces, but I need to be able to get away into a deep workspace, or when I'm looking for wellness, I need to get away into that retreat space.
So my last question is a very typical particular question. John, you work for a really big architectural firm. You get to work on really big projects with big budgets. You have engineers working in your firm, probably. You work with the best constructing firms. Yet I can imagine that at some point you would like to switch roles with Pallavi, working for a boutique firm, not hindered by all of this massive knowledge and massive experience behind you. If that's the case, what would you like to design? What would you do when you would be Pallavi, and vice versa? Thinking of educational spaces.
Thinking of educational spaces.
So what is not possible in your current role with your current firm, and you think would be possible when you would be working for this really nice boutique firm, and vice versa?
It's a great question. I just have to say, and I know some of my colleagues are on. You couldn't find somebody who loves SOM more. I think we really have the smartest people on the planet. We have access to some of the best engineers in the world that I can just call and get on a Zoom instantly. So if there's really complex questions that come up, it's like I can talk to people who can think in a very high level about very, very complex and difficult questions. And I don't know if I could do without that network of experts that we have here at SOM. And in terms of scale, I just want to say, we do everything from, you saw the schoolhouse. That's a pretty small scale type of project that I had an idea for and got to sort of promote. So we, lots of ideas at SOM kind of come from the ground up anyway. So I think it's a great firm that values ideas and values design. And I'm not sure I would want to be in a boutique practice. I have done that earlier in my career, and so I have a sense of the pluses and minuses. Another big plus is we have IT, so I don't have to fix my own software or all those types of things from when I was working in a small practice that I don't miss. So I just get to focus on design, which is my true passion.
Okay, so in short, you're happy where you are.
Sorry, I know that's not a great answer to the question.
It's a fantastic answer. So what about you, Pallavi? Would you like to work at SOM?
No, I come from the big practice culture, the structure of big.
So we switched places, so that's good.
We have switched places. I mean, obviously, you know, I'm envious of John because they've designed Burj Khalifa, and I can only dream of, you know, designing such an iconic building. No one's going to come to Roar and be like, hey, do you want to design the world's tallest tower? That ain't going to happen. But the reason I left the kind of big practice setting is I really think I wanted to be like this Renaissance woman, right? Like, you know, Leonardo da Vinci knew about science and math and architecture and medicine. And I just thought in a big practice, you sometimes get siloed. You're a great designer. You just do the creative stuff. You're an awesome technical designer. You just do that. You're a site. And I was just like, no, hang on. I love everything about design. I want to be in it. I want to do my own research. I really do wish I had IT though, John. I mean, when I'm uploading my own software, it's painful. And I really do wish I could call your structural engineers and be like, hey, I have this great idea. Can you help me? But, you know, I think there's benefit. Like, I would never discredit a big practice. I think everybody should work at a big practice because you learn so much. And it's such a amazing ecosystem for creatives, right? So I miss that. I miss that buzz. But I'm just going in a different direction right now.
That's also a great answer. Thank you very much. In fact, thank both of you for your great answers and your great insights. And what I took away from both of you is that going forward, education classrooms, so educational buildings, need to be more light, closer to nature, offer more space for people to walk about, to meet each other, work with biophilic materials and shapes and forms, have great air circulation. Did I forget anything, John, Pallavi? Help me out here.
You're good, Robert. This is all recorded.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Easy to clean, durable, natural light. Yeah.
You know what? It sounds to me like the future of the office, the future of the workplace. The exact same things came up when discussing the future of the office. Isn't that remarkable? It is remarkable.
It's just good design, yeah.
Children go to work really early. Let's not make it child labor. So thank you both for being with us. Thank you for being with us, people in the audience. I have one last slide to share with you in a minute, and that is announcing the next live jury session of the Frame Awards that will take place next week, Tuesday, the 2nd of February at 4 p.m. Central European Time. I will be here again in Amsterdam hosting that session. Make sure you watch the session to learn a lot from what is happening in interior design today and what the biggest trends are going forward, navigating the future. Thanks again, Pallavi and John. Thank you for watching. Have a good day. Bye-bye. This was Frame Live.
Bye-bye. Thank you.